In this section, we'll look at the civil rights struggles of Hispanic Americans, and then Native Americans, and finally gay and lesbian Americans in the 1960s. First, turning to Hispanics, I should note that during World War II, the government created the Bracero program, which was a temporary worker program. You needed workers in the United States because of all the shortage of manpower, and so they documented and brought Mexican and Central Americans into work, and then the idea was at the end of the war they would go home. Well, in the 1950s, you see new irrigation systems adding 7.5 million acres to the agricultural lands of the Southwest. And what this did was this stimulated farm owners' desire for cheap Mexican labor. And so with the end of the Bracero program, but the increase in demand for agricultural workers, we get a real big influx of illegal Hispanics crossing the southern border to work in the farmland. And so in 1951, the government decided to reintroduce the Bracero program. The idea was to provide the labor but keep track of them, and that way they'd be able to have them return if they when the work was no longer needed. It didn't have much success because the people would come, but then they would vanish and they would stay here illegally. The new Spanish-speaking arrivals didn't exactly fit into the conformist culture of the 1950s, and during a brief recession in the mid-1950s, the Eisenhower administration enacted Operation Wetback. Wetback was a term of derision for illegal American immigrants who supposedly had swam across the Rio Grande into the United States. The Operation Wetback deported approximately 3 million Hispanics and even violated the rights of Hispanic citizens. It broke up a number of families. Of course, the business owners still needed the labor, and illegal Hispanic migration continued. And what you begin to see is it begins to frustrate the legal Hispanics because Americans just saw Hispanics when they assumed that they were all illegal. And so you see the League of United Latin American Citizens, which had been first formed in 1929, beginning to mobilize in the 50s and early 60s to try to fight discrimination against all Hispanics. It didn't have a whole lot of success because people just assumed that they were all illegal. In the 1960s, you do see again more activism on behalf of Hispanics, of course resembling and reflecting the African American civil rights movement. The leader, if you think of the most significant Hispanic leader, would be Cesar Chavez. He was a devout Roman Catholic and an admirer of Martin Luther King Jr., who founded the group called the United Farm Workers. The goal was to unionize Hispanic migrant and agricultural workers and press for better wages and conditions. They organized a strike of California grape pickers in 1965, which was successful and led to higher wages. Chavez then became kind of like a symbol, like King. Robert Kennedy even called him, quote, one of the heroic figures of our time, unquote. Like the civil rights movement for African Americans, and like the women's movement, the Hispanics became more militant by the late 1960s. In California, young Hispanics formed the Brown Berets. Obviously, it was modeled after the Black Panthers. It demanded to be referred to as Hispanics to be referred to as Chicanos as a mark of their ethnic identity, and it demanded such things as bilingual education and more government spending for Hispanics. In Colorado, one militant group, the Crusade for Justice, demanded Hispanics retake a territory earlier controlled by them, but usurped by whites, conveniently forgetting, of course, that the Hispanics had usurped it from the Native Americans. Turning to Native Americans remained one of the poorest ethnic groups in the United States. Between 1900 and 1930, Native American nations had lost more than half of the 100 million acre lands they had controlled in the late 19th century. A process of assimilating the Native Americans had been undertaken with the Dawes Act in the 1880s, but it had been repealed in the 1930s, and what you end up having is sort of Native Americans in a reestablished reservation system on the worst land. And this was ultimately disastrous for the Native Americans. Many of them had been cheated off their land, and many had simply left to go to urban areas where they remained awfully poor. In the early 1960s, Native Americans joined the civil rights protest as well. In 1961, representatives from 67 tribes met in Chicago to draw up a Declaration of Purposes, pledging to work together to improve conditions. 3 years later, in 1964, Native American groups lobbied Washington for inclusion into Johnson's War on Poverty. Point out that Native Americans suffered even worse than African Americans, the highest disease rate, death rates, the poorest education and housing of any group. Johnson responded with the National Council on Indian Opportunity in 1965. What it did was it worked to channel some of the Great Society funds directly into Indian community development, health services, job training, and youth activities. In 1968, LBJ became the first president to send Congress a special message seeking to better treatment of Indians. But by the late 1860s, the movement, like African Americans and like the women's movement, had become more radical and militant. In 1968, groups clashed with police in Washington, demanding the U.S. government abide by old fishing treaties in Puget Sound. The following year, Indian groups occupied Alcatraz Island off San Francisco, which is where the old federal prison had been. They claimed to have discovered the island, and they offered to buy it for $24 in beads and cloth, which of course was the same price the Dutch had paid to the Indians for Manhattan Island in 1626. For over a year, the Native American activists occupied Alcatraz Island. In the late 1960s, Native American activists formed the American Indian Movement with the acronym AIM. It was another more militant group, kind of like the Black Panthers or the Brown Berets, and it established armed patrols to protect Native Americans from harassment by the police. The trouble was it never had any one charismatic leader like the Hispanic Americans or the African Americans. It did have a very famous incident in 1973 when a group of Lakota Indians and some people from AIM seized and occupied the small South Dakota town of Wounded Knee. And this was a symbolic gesture because Wounded Knee had been the site of an 1890 massacre. AIM sometimes got into controversy. For example, in the mid-1970s, 2 FBI agents were on a reservation and an AIM activist, Leonard Peltier, was charged with murdering them and was sent to prison. There was a lot of question about whether he was guilty, and it became a cause célèbre for civil rights activists. Here you can see John Lennon with his Free Peltier sign on his hand. Peltier is still in prison today. Turning to gay and lesbian civil rights, the first gay civil rights organization was the Mattachine Society, formed in 1951 in Chicago. It was formed in part with the efforts of Harry Hay, who is sometimes considered the founding father of the gay rights movement. And in about 4 years later, in 1955, the Daughters Habilitas formed. That was the first national lesbian group, and what they would do is they would lobby and for gay and lesbian rights, much like any civil rights group. But they, of course, faced a lot more violence, and they had to be a lot more careful. The reasons were obvious. It was because gay sex was illegal in the United States under the nation's sodomy laws. And so you could be arrested for having consensual gay sex, even in private. The first state to decriminalize consensual gay sex in private was Illinois in 1961. Many people consider the dawn of the gay rights movement to be in 1969 in New York City, when the police were raiding a gay bar, the Stonewall Inn. And what ended up happening was crowds of gay and lesbians appeared when the police were there, catching the police in the bar. And so it was several days of near rioting, and the police were caught in the bar, and it became very national headlines and really mobilized the gay rights movement. Just recently, President Obama has named the Stonewall Inn a national historic site. By 1973, there were over 800 gay and lesbian organizations formed. Many of them were students at colleges. Like movements for African American civil rights and women's rights, the gay and lesbian civil rights movement remains quite diverse. Some gay and lesbian Americans prefer to remain behind the scenes, as they would say, in the closet, while others seek to flaunt their sexuality in a way to cause publicity for their cause. Most of the gay and rights accomplishments were in the 1970s. But you really see the roots of the movement growing in the late 1960s. This concludes this section on Hispanic, Native American, and gay and lesbian civil rights.